Welcome and good evening to everyone here in Gießen and online to the inaugural event of the Planetary Lecture Series. My name is Frederik Hanisch and I'm Scientific Manager of the panel on Planetary Thinking, which organizes this event. The panel on Planetary Thinking aims to understand what it means to be part of a planet. Planetary phenomena, crisis, and solution strategies are examined from a holistic as well as reflexive perspective in order to rethink and expand traditional sustainability research. Therefore, we ask the big questions. In terms of the past, how did planetary forces form us? How did diverse societies acquire planetary forces that are capable of transforming Earth? In regards to the present, how can different societies deal with regular planetary changes that are beyond their influence? What does it mean for societies to have planetary powers? How should they be deployed and when should they be withheld? And prospectively, which planetary forces beyond our influence can we anticipate? Which planetary dynamics can we ally or reunite with? And which alliances should we quit, if possible? To address these kinds of complex questions, the Panel on Planetary Thinking was founded in 2020 as a think tank within the university to contribute to a university-wide anchoring of planetary thinking. Accordingly, the goal of the Panel on Planetary Thinking is to be an intellectual focal point and exploration space for the debate and consequences of an emerging planetary paradigm. Currently, the panel is composed of about 30 colleagues from across the university, representing a wide range of disciplines. The members not only take part in our events and carry some food for thought back into their faculties, they also enrich the panel with various activities, ranging from direct support of our visiting scholars and artists to proposals for new transdisciplinary teaching formats. As many of you are present here today, I would like to take this opportunity, and we from the team of the Panel on Planetary Thinking would like to take this opportunity to thank you for these different kinds of support. Out of the various activities of the panel, I want to briefly highlight one of them, namely the Planetary Scholars and Artists in Residence program, as we just welcomed our first guests here in Gießen at the beginning of April. The Planetary Scholars and Artists in Residence program provides the space for intensive collaborative work on how the humanities, social science, natural science, life science, and the arts grapple with the manifold relations between societies and the planet. Each semester, we invite at least one scientist and one artist to Gießen. Currently, the first round of fellows, namely Claudia Hartl, Matthias Kessler, and Clemens Finkelstein, are working on the overarching theme of planetary materials, ranging from tangible wood and tree rings to vibration as a planetary transmaterial and social sculpture. We are more than honored to have you here in Gießen and very much look forward to your workshop taking place 23rd to 24th of June. So please, everyone, mark these dates in your calendars. More information on a very planetary and performative event follows shortly. Currently, we invite applications to the second round of the program, which focuses on planetary spaces next year. And you can find a call and more information on our website. The topics for the consecutive calls in next year will be addressing planetary times, planetary agency, and planetary politics. But now let's get back to the main reason of our gathering today, the Planetary Lecture Series. The lecture series takes place once a semester. It's composed of 40 minutes of presentation, followed by 40 minutes of discussion, which is open by a first respondent. The Planetary Lecture Series aims to explore novel avenues, open and not closed debates, provoke and challenge the current state of thought towards a planetary way of thinking. And there could be no better speaker for this first event as the pioneer of Earth system law, Louis Kotzé. Louis is Research Professor of Law at the Faculty of Law, Northwest University of South Africa, and Senior Professional Fellow in Earth System Law at the University of Lincoln, United Kingdom. His research focuses on human rights, socio-ecological justice, and environmental constitutionalism, law and the Anthropocene, and Earth System Law. He has over 170 publications on these themes. Recent books include Global Environmental Constitutionalism in the Anthropocene from 2016, Environmental Law and Governance for the Anthropocene in 2017, Sustainable Development Goals, Law, Theory and Implementation from 2018, and from last year, a research handbook on law, governance, and planetary boundaries. He is assistant editor of the journal Earth System Governance, a senior fellow of the Earth System Governance Network, member of its scientific steering committee, and co-convener of the network's task force on Earth System Law. He is recipient of several research awards, including one from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, a forerunner of planetary thinking, which also brought him to Gießen before, which we didn't know when we invited him. In 2018, he was awarded a European Commission Horizon 2020 Marie Curie Fellowship to lead a project at the University of Lincoln titled Global Ecological Custodianship, Innovative International Law, Environmental Law for the Anthropocene. He currently is the Klaus Töpfer Sustainability Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam and works on the theme Earth System Law for the Anthropocene. The first respondent of Louis' lecture is a member of the panel on planetary thinking. Thilo Maraun is professor of public law and international law at the Justus Liebig University Gießen, and the starting point of his research on international environmental law dates back, if I'm informed correctly, almost 30 years with a German article, and I translate, Disarmament and Environmental Protection, a Conflict of Interest under International Law. Thilo Maraun worked as a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg and was an assistant professor at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt. In 2001, after a short period of time as a professor of European law at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, he was appointed professor here in Gießen. In addition, since 2001, he holds the position as a permanent visiting fellow at the Faculty of Law at the University of Luzern in Switzerland. Since 2016, he has been head of the research group on international law at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. And just last year, he has been appointed extraordinary professor of international arms control law at the Faculty of Law of the University of Amsterdam. So thank you both very much for following our invitation. And now let's hand over to Louis. A warm welcome back here in Gießen, I would say. Thank you so much.
So good evening, everyone. It's really lovely to be back. It has been a couple of years, I think about 6. And when I arrived at the Hauptbahnhof today, it was I had a lot of deja vu and fond memories of many visits to Gießen, and especially in this post-pandemic phase that we are entering. It is especially nice to be here in presence and to see a lot of familiar faces and also to meet new people, certainly tonight. A very warm thank you to Frederick and his team, and certainly also to the University of Gießen and the panel on planetary thinking for the warm invitation and for the privilege to be here and to share some ideas with you, and certainly also to engage in a conversation with you around some of the ideas that we will be discussing tonight. And I'm especially happy that Thilo Maraun will reflect on the paper. Thilo is a longtime colleague and friend, and it makes this evening all the more pleasurable to have him here on my side. Thank you very much, Thilo, for agreeing to be here. So where do we start off? I want to share some thoughts on planetary law for the Anthropocene. And I think it is fairly common knowledge that we have now entered the age of the human, which is also called the Anthropocene. Now, the Anthropocene is characterized by Earth system decay, by possibly irreversible impacts on planetary integrity, increasing zoonotic diseases, intensified but differentiately distributed vulnerabilities that characterize the uneven world order, and the rise of geopolitical conflicts. And I think this is the crisis of the Anthropocene, namely alarming climatic, ecological, and public health threats and trends that are unfolding with very little evidence of abating. And the convergence of these trends could lead to a comprehensive crisis where multiple risks materialize in reinforcing ways. And the converging and ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the climate, and certainly now the Ukraine crisis, with the questions about energy security and global geopolitical issues that raises, is a very good case in point, I think. So in this presentation, on paper rather, discussion, I want to disentangle briefly and critique the role of law, and specifically international environmental law, in creating the Anthropocene crisis, this converging crisis, as well as international environmental law's inability, thus far at least, to effectively address the crisis or to offer any meaningful solutions that can craft a sustainable and just future. So with a view to informing possible legal reforms also during Stockholm Plus 50, which is in a couple of weeks, and thereafter, not that I think that my proposals will be listened to there, but just for myself to think about, certainly, I also want to look ahead and ask, how can international environmental law be reformed to initiate a long overdue global governance paradigm shift that can actually confront the deepening Anthropocene crisis? And I'll do so by first briefly reflecting on the notion of the Anthropocene, and then we'll look at some of the failures of international environmental law, and then briefly at three proposals for transforming international environmental law. Now, while the process formally denoting the Anthropocene as the new geological epoch is still underway, the term has become really widely used in popular culture, scientific discourse, and even policy debates. In addition to the more conventional scientific qualities that denote the Anthropocene as a sort of epochal manifestation of concrete socio- and biomaterial conditions, the term has also become a device for re-examining and discussing, like we are doing now, the role of humanity in the natural world or in relation to non-human beings. The Anthropocene and contemporary scientific insights that are developing around this emerging trope, I think, is shifting the focus away from what has always been perceived to be very localized human impacts on a sort of an externalized, pristine environment that's out there. And it is shifting the focus away from this externalized environment to the Promethean abilities of humans to destabilize the entire Earth system. So as geological agents, humans are now part of the Earth system, and we see this through the lens of the Anthropocene. We are not masters of the Earth system anymore. The Anthropocene therefore also suggests that the environment is not really something out there, disconnected from us, and that we can manage and exploit for selfish short-term gain. So what it does, I think, is it situates humans in a coupled historical and Earth system context. And in doing so, it functions as a very powerful trope or framework communicating a human interspecies responsibility also to act in the face of the looming global ecological crisis. Now, what does the Anthropocene tell us about the role that international environmental law has played and will play in mediating the role or the relations between humans and other Earth system constituents? Now, a colleague, Joshua Gellers, argues in general terms that the pronouncement of this new geological epoch has created the discursive space that is necessary for critically examining the law and imagining how it might be reconceived to address the complex problems caused by industrialization on the scale of the entire Earth system. And I think that there are, among many others, three overarching issues that we could consider tonight. And the first is that the existing set of international environmental law has been crafted and designed and I'm sure Thilo can say much more about this than I can, based on our collective human experience in the relatively stable and predictable and harmonious Holocene epoch. So we've designed the rules within that context, because that is what we knew. And a critical concern here is that international environmental law has not evolved in step with the continuously changing conditions that now characterize the Anthropocene crisis. In other words, while the context in which international environmental law operates has changed, international law itself has not changed in tandem with that context. It instead remains stuck within the Holocene mindset, which is that of a world consisting of powerful sovereign states that have absolute authority over everything and everyone in their territories, despite the best attempts of international law. The right to exploit, assumably, unlimited human and non-human resources, because that is what we call nature, it's a resource, in the name of unrestricted neoliberal economic development. And despite clear scientific evidence to the contrary, that human impacts on Earth system stability are negligible, and that planetary integrity will always remain intact. So the existing paradigm misses a crucial point, as Laura May and Emile Boulot say. They believe that it does not adequately recognize that interconnected social, technical, and natural factors all cumulatively and collectively shape planetary processes. In other words, international environmental law fails to acknowledge that it is not possible to conceive of and address environmental issues without understanding them as problematic junctures of social, technical, and natural dynamics. So in terms of the current approach, we remain on a mission to save the planet, one piece of environmental law or treaty at a time. And this might not be enough anymore. Second, and related to this first consideration, we should assume that there will no longer be an environment as we know it to protect in the Anthropocene. The environment is already being altered in profound ways. We see this, the scientific evidence is there. My colleague Rakyun Kim from Utrecht convincingly also argues that the environment itself is undergoing profound transformations as the Earth system tends towards a new, less habitable basin of attraction. The biosphere is not simply disappearing into the technosphere, but a new type of environment is arriving, as it always is. And this time, it will in all likelihood not be very friendly to humans and many other forms of life on Earth. So modern environmentalism, therefore, has come to an end with the Anthropocene rupture, in the sense that the environment no longer exists as an object for environmental law to protect, at least the environment as we knew it when we designed the rules. So with the Holocene environment rapidly transforming into, let's call it, Anthropocene environment, the central objective of international environmental law will have to change from trying to incrementally ensure environmental protection, as we've been doing, and addressing negative externalities of transactions, to an objective that instead pursues planetary stewardship, to one that addresses the underlying systemic conditions and drivers that cause all of these negative externalities, and one that prioritizes planetary integrity and resilience. So it's not enough anymore to solve the problem. In the end, we must look at the structural drivers that actually cause the problem. Now, the third consideration is that international environmental law also contributes to the Anthropocene crisis and is unable to provide sustainable and just solutions for this crisis. So it is not only guilty, in a way, in not doing something about it, but it is also complicit in causing the crisis. And one example is carbon and the deepening energy security crisis, the one that we are currently experiencing because of the Ukraine conflict, for example. Humans have mastered Earth's ancient and finite carbon energy sources through the very clever invention and deployment of technologies and associated neoliberal political, economic, and corporate institutions and processes. And these have been, all of this, have been and still are regulated by very specific practices, institutions, and imaginaries that have channeled the flow of hydrocarbons in very particular directions, volumes, and velocities, mostly from the global south to the global north, as we know it. And international environmental law has been a part of this process. Decarbonization seems to be a key element in the toolbox to address the climate crisis, if we read all of the IPCC reports. But international environmental law has not yet managed to prioritize decarbonization in its rules and governance institutions. And we see this through the lackluster commitments by states during almost all recent climate conferences of the parties, all recent climate COPs. By not actively pushing the decarbonization agenda, international environmental law, I think at least, has played and continues to play a role in unlocking the potential of fossil fuels that form the foundation of contemporary society and its unsustainable global energy metabolism. In all fairness, one must also say and admit that international environmental law has made important contributions to advance environmental protection in the Holocene. That is true. But it is also recognized that there are clear constraints on what international environmental law can do and can be expected to do as it develops further. If international law, environmental law, is to do more, it must move beyond the constraints of the current architecture and framing and embrace a fundamental reconceptualization of existing models of governance, whether economic, political, social, or legal. And I think very few of us will argue that that shouldn't be the case. Let's look at three constraints or challenges which are preventing a meaningful and much needed progression to a form of planetary law that can actually govern Promethean humans in this new geological epoch. So first, protecting a Holocene environment. Now, the environmental problems of international environmental law were seen as emerging, as we've said, within the Holocene context. And this posed minimal challenges to the type of top-down, unconnected, mostly state-driven, command and control regulatory institutions of international environmental law that sought to tackle negative externalities of transactions. Now, the result is, of course, that the architecture of international environmental law, including its core assumptions, its orientation, also its ethical orientation, its operation and objectives, have become out of tune with the reality of the Anthropocene's converging crisis and the multiple interlinked Earth system governance challenges emanating from this crisis. As we've said earlier, a new understanding of Earth system science and its complex interrelated processes, aspects, and constituents requires urgent changes to governance approaches. And the idea of the Earth system as an object of study was first conceptualized by Earth system scientists. And it's only more recently, fairly recently, that the insights from Earth system science have found purchase in some social science domains like law and governance, with many scholars converging around the idea of Earth system governance, a network that some of us in the room are members of, for example. So Earth system governance is an example of an approach that confronts and seeks to solve the problem of misfit between the complexity of the Earth system on the one hand and our current fragmented regulatory systems on the other. Now, while the emergence of such frameworks, such as Earth system governance, show that some sustainability scholars are starting to grasp the importance of Earth systems thinking, I don't think that the same can be said for international environmental law and its practitioners, at least not in general terms. Practically speaking, I think the lack of appreciation for systems complexity in international environmental law can, for example, lead to the prioritization of one environmental problem over another. And it reinforces the creation of these siloed, disjointed regulatory regimes, which may lead to problem shifting between the different planetary boundaries and the different environmental regimes. And this is exactly what is happening. And conversely, if we do not integrate or better coordinate international environmental institutions in line with how planetary boundaries, for example, are interacting as they are, we run the risk of protecting one boundary at the cost of another. The second issue is anthropocentrism, and a lot has already been said about law's anthropocentrism. But it is worthwhile to repeat it, I think, because international environmental law's anthropocentrism facilitates environmentally destructive and exploitative neoliberal economic development, which in turn causes massive global injustices between the global north and the global south, also within countries in the global north and the global south, between species, human, non-human, and certainly also between present and future generations. Now, the Anthropocene crisis arose in part because of the prevailing anthropocentric worldview that permeates virtually all human systems. It is a worldview that places humans at the center of earthly existence. And anthropocentrism has promoted, in doing that, selective exceptionalism, human exceptionalism, human prominence, and also privilege. And these are all constructed and continue to be maintained also through the law. Now, the anthropocentrism of law in general terms is also specifically clear from the provisions of international environmental law. And this is intensely problematic, considering that international environmental law is actually intended to protect the non-human world from human impacts. And this insight leads our colleague Prudence Taylor to say that international environmental law has directly contributed to the environmental crisis because our laws reflect and affirm this anthropocentric environmental ethic. They have become part of the problem. International environmental law merely perpetuates the crisis and is reduced to a means of suppressing the symptoms. So the anthropocentric ethic of international environmental law is certainly evident in numerous of its past and present provisions. For example, the foundations of this ethic, I think, was already laid in the early 1800s and 1900s with the adoption of the earliest international environmental law agreements, such as the London Convention for the Protection of Wild Animals, Birds and Fish in Africa, of 1900. And these environmental conservation instruments pursued a very narrow interest. The dominant strain was utilitarian and anthropocentric. Their benefit, if any, for the environment was hardly more than a side effect. It was simply to protect sufficient resources for colonial countries in the global north. Now, the 1972 Stockholm Declaration further cemented international environmental law's anthropocentrism. And in many ways, this was the birth of modern international environmental law. And this declaration was pivotal and still is, even 50 years later, as we will see in 2 weeks again in Stockholm, in shaping international environmental law and its anthropocentric ethic. It proclaimed, namely, the centrality of the human, and especially the male human subject, as a keystone principle in the entire declaration. For example, according to its preamble, it doesn't use the word human, it uses the word man. Is a separate but elevated entity from his submissive environment that he creates and controls, and that belongs to him, and that must sustain him. So you see also this kind of gendered anthropocentrism in the earlier instruments of international environmental law. Now, following from Stockholm in 1972 and onwards, states continued down this human-centered, neoliberal environment versus development approach. And with the blanket endorsement of the haloed, but I would say deeply deceiving idea of sustainable development, the principle of sustainable development, these conferences, many multilateral environmental treaties, and these grand development visions, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, have further promoted international environmental law's neoliberal anthropocentrism. And this is problematic because sustainable development has become the dominant framing of nature in global environmental governance. It promotes human self-interest, while there is a self-defeating assumption that the increased use of these type of developmental discourses of self-interest can actually promote better ways of living well with other species as well as with ourselves. In all honesty, of course, the initial motivations that generated the notion of sustainable development were positive, in that its proponents sought to achieve social justice through development that should be sustainable. Nothing wrong with that. And these initial proponents understood the increasing severity of the environment development contradiction arising from the biophysical limits of endless growth. However, numerous scholars, especially critical legal scholars and law and development scholars, now agree that sustainable development, as it is currently understood, is very different from its original conception. A central point of critique is that sustainable development promises what it cannot deliver, due to its central contradiction between economic growth and ecological sustainability, and the false promise that endless growth is actually possible on a finite planet, where the human footprint is already far greater than the Earth's ability to sustain life. We have already exceeded that threshold. So the promise is false. And this delusion of infinite natural assets that will always be available to sustain an ever-growing human population is evident from the way how states use the principle of sustainable development in international environmental law and other development law and policies more generally, to argue that all that is needed is to strike a sort of Brundtlandian balance between economic development, social development, and environmental protection. The reality, however, is that it will be impossible to strike any such balance if one or more of these underlying conditions are eroded. And this is exactly what's happening, certainly, with the social and the environmental pillars. So, in short, it is not enough anymore to simply try and strike a balance. We need to move on. And some concrete evidence, I mean, it is always difficult to empirically prove that the reliance on the principle of sustainable development actually leads to ecological degradation. I don't know of any empirical study that's been done to show that. I think one can say that that is the case because we've had this principle for so many years, but the law has not managed to change much. But it is, for example, becoming more evident in more recent studies that focuses on the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals, as we know, are not legally binding. It's not part of formal international law or international environmental law. But they have some normative steering power and effects through the softer governance through goals approach. And insofar as the SDGs are also linked to the more deliberate steering effects of more formal international environmental law. And one major finding of this study that assessed the political steering effects was a sort of a midterm assessment that was done by Frank Bierman and colleagues in Utrecht. And one major finding of this study looked at planetary integrity, and it found, and I quote, owing to ontological and systemic factors and limitations in their design and purpose, the available literature that was surveyed does not see the SDGs as having any significant potential to steer governance towards a prioritization of planetary integrity. Whatever indirect steering effects the SDGs might have in this respect are merely implied through the environmental goals way down at the bottom of all of the SDGs. So in sum, sustainable development is not a socio-ecologically friendly principle that can support, I think, the well-being of the entire living order in the Anthropocene epoch. A third concern is about normative ambition and the lack of ambition of international environmental law. So with few exceptions, the substantive norms of international environmental law, including those that shape its objectives, are not sufficiently ambitious to limit human behavior in a way that could safeguard planetary integrity. International environmental law inevitably seems to always chase the lowest common denominator that is shaped, of course, admittedly, by political and strong economic interests as well. It's not only law's fault, there's other factors at play as well. But it still remains unable to achieve the deep structural reforms because it is constrained from ever developing the necessary ambition to overcome these limitations. For example, the climate planetary boundary is one of two core planetary boundaries, and it has already been crossed. Johan Rockström's team in Potsdam has done the research. International climate law, because of its unambitious temperature targets that are not commensurate with the severity of the climate crisis and the scientific evidence pointing to this crisis, is unable to do much about this crisis. The weak commitments by states under the Paris Agreement are projected to be wholly insufficient to hold the global average temperature increase to below 2 degrees centigrade, let alone to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. In other words, the current legal boundaries of the international climate regime are unable to ensure that the climate change boundary is not transgressed. So the boundaries of these two issues do not line up. And recent initiatives to reform international environmental law remain disappointingly unambitious and merely reinforce the status quo ante of international environmental law's path-dependent norms. For example, and just one example, the proposed Global Pact for the Environment. You might have heard of this, a French-led initiative, which sought to draft a type of a new framework global treaty for the environment with a global environmental right. And this was said to be the new champion of environmental protection. And a lot of hopes was pinned on this, has been criticized across the board for its lack of normative ambition because it simply reiterated the principles that we already had in international environmental law. Now, to conclude, 3 brief proposals for transforming international environmental law. And of course, there might be many others. I just thought about these because I think they might resonate with the type of challenges that I've highlighted. The first one is for law to embrace an Earth system perspective. The area that I work in, and Frederic also certainly to some extent, called Earth system law. And for international environmental law, I think to be better able to respond to integrated Earth system governance challenges, it must embrace an Earth system perspective. And scholars have been exploring alternative Earth system oriented visions for international environmental law, and one is Earth system law, which was first proposed in 2019. And in essence, the project of Earth system law offers an alternative framing for international environmental law to facilitate the type of transformations and governance interventions that are actually in step with a continuously transforming Earth system and that are required to address the Anthropocene's crisis. So Earth system law is a new legal paradigm that seeks to disrupt foundational assumptions of conventional law And such a substantial reorganization requires, of course, that law sheds its reactive and individualist tendencies in favor of the principles of, there are many, but three, inclusivity, interdependencies, and complexity. So the argument is that once law can recognize that it should be inclusive, that it should be reactive and sensitive to independent relationships, and that it recognizes that it has to deal with complexity, then we're on the road, a better road to somewhere worthwhile, at least. So Earth system law is not a new body of law in the sense that it's such as human rights law or trade law. It rather offers a new frame of thinking that introduces the Earth system perspective into the legal domain. And it urges lawyers and policymakers, for example, to think about law generally and international environmental law specifically in Earth system terms. And it also encourages us to grapple more deliberately with the natural science aspects of the Earth system and to translate these into the social sciences domain of politics and law in a way that also meaningfully embraces and encourages Earth system governmentality. Now, how can this Earth system-orientated legal paradigm actually assist in reforming international environmental law? That's always the question that I get. So I've tried to foresee it for tonight, and hopefully I can offer an example before the question is asked. Because in theory, it's a lovely idea. How does it work in practice? So some scholars allude to the practical value of Earth system law by pointing to how this new legal paradigm requires scholars and policymakers to consciously embrace the Earth system science as a tool to shape new legal norms. So in other words, Earth system law builds bridges between the natural science domain of Earth system science that tries to understand the Earth system and the domain of social science that explores how to respond to Earth system transformations through human norms. And it opens up a sort of cross and interdisciplinary dialogue and conversations among a diverse range of actors and agents who might be able to inform whatever type of law would be more suitable in the Anthropocene context. Now, while international environmental law, as we know, famously international lawyers especially, have mostly been a monodisciplinary endeavor, Earth system law therefore very concretely urges us and those who design, interpret, and apply the norms to actively engage within this inter- and transdisciplinary conversations and learning and processes of knowledge production to try and understand how the Earth system is changing and what we need to do about it. The second option is ecologizing international environmental law. So a precondition, I think, for reframing and reimagining international environmental law is openness, to being open to alternative, other ways of seeing, of being, of knowing that produce epistemologies of care, of humility, instead of anthropocentric epistemologies of dominance and mastery, such as those that are being produced by the neoliberal mindset of sustainable development. So epistemologies of care and humility are predicated upon a relational sense of solidarity between everyone, including the non-human world, that recognizes that the subjugation and suffering of one is in fact indicative of the oppression of everyone. And one already observes the emergence of alternative ecological ways of seeing, being, knowing, and caring that offers opportunities to appreciate how worlds are known and enacted so as to more ethically and effectively navigate contemporary socio-ecological challenges facing the planet. An example, there are several examples, we'll just use one, is the idea of buen vivir, or living well in Spanish, that forms the basis of the evolution of the rights of nature paradigm in several Latin American mostly, but other countries as well. So as a central idea in Andean cosmovisions, buen vivir promotes an alternative, certainly a radical alternative, to new liberal sustainable development, a concept that is in fact alien to Andean cosmovisions, their conceptual categories and languages of indigenous people. Buen Vivir is a biocentric counterweight to anthropocentrism, in which Pachamama, or Mother Earth, is understood as an ever-present deity who is the source and sustainer of all life, of which humans are only a very, very small, although very powerful part. It eschews the notion that human beings are at the center of all concern and the only source of values, and it shuns our obsessions with growth and progress because it does not conceive a beginning or an end in time in the way that visions of progress and development from point A to point B, as we understand it in Western terms, does. And this means that there can be no development insofar as there is no preliminary situation of underdevelopment. There is no point A and point B. Well-being is possible and is measured not in terms of gross domestic product, but, for example, in the case of Bhutan, which has enshrined the principle of happiness as a measure of well-being in their laws. And well-being flows from the communal life in harmony with nature, and it is consistent with principles of reciprocity, complementarity, and relationality. And we already see the growing influence that Buen Vivir is exercising in Latin American jurisprudence through its incorporation in several constitutions, national development plans, and so forth. But this radical worldview has not yet managed to infiltrate international environmental law in any meaningful way. And the only example that I could find in the international domain is perhaps the World Charter for Nature of 1982, that was adopted, notably, with a majority vote by the United Nations General Assembly at the time. Although it is an example, possibly, and Thilo certainly would be able to say more about this. It's an example, this charter, of the softest of soft law instruments. It's very soft. It has the potential, I think, to offer an alternative of what an ecological form of international environmental law could be. It, for example, recognizes, and I quote, humankind is a part of nature, and life depends on the uninterrupted functioning of natural systems. And every form of life is unique, warranting respect regardless of its worth to humans. Remember, this is an international law instrument where this has been recognized. Almost unimaginable to think it would be stated in these terms in any instrument that is being negotiated today. So such formulations that recognize the value of nature as an end in itself, irrespective of its value to humans, is the type of legal language that could reflect an all-embracing epistemology of care and humility that we would need to see. And finally, increasing normative ambition. I think it's fairly obvious to say that international environmental law will have to raise its level of ambition, both in terms of the substance and its objectives, if it is to stay relevant in the Anthropocene epoch. The ultimate purpose of international environmental law should clearly be maintaining and restoring the integrity of life on Earth, of Earth's life support system. And to this end, several scholars have been paying attention to terms such as planetary integrity, ecological integrity, which they argue could become a Grundnorm, as you would be very familiar with in the German legal system, certainly, constitutional law, a foundational norm of international environmental law. And this can also provide the ecological framework and can act as the center point on which the entire body of international environmental law balances. And in addition, the degree of heightened ambition that any new form of international environmental law should ideally strive for must be guided by what Earth system science tells us about the state of planetary decay. It's as simple as that. One option that has been extensively explored in a recent study is that the future of international environmental law can and should probably be guided by the planetary boundaries framework developed by Johan Rockström and his colleagues, which would enable a process whereby Earth system science can shape international environmental law, and whereby international environmental law can become more responsive to state-of-the-art Earth system science, while meaningfully translating the planetary boundaries that have been determined by Earth system scientists into legal boundaries. I just came across this quote a couple of days ago when I read Paul Crutzen's, as many of you would know, he coined the notion Anthropocene. And it really struck me when I read it, because I don't think it has been ever more relevant. Unless there's a global catastrophe, a meteorite impact, a world war, or a pandemic, and he said this in 2002, mankind will remain a major environmental force for many millennia. Now, obviously, the pandemic thus far has not managed to do anything about the situation. The rest remains to be seen. But he says that a daunting task lies ahead for scientists and engineers to guide society towards environmentally sustainable management during the era of the Anthropocene. And this will require, and I think this is the essence, this will require appropriate human behavior at all scales. Now, law is one of the most effective tools of social organization that we have at our disposal to ensure humans actually behave appropriately as part of a much larger but increasingly fragile Earth system. After all, we've been very successfully using law for centuries to serve inappropriate short-term interests and material well-being. Legally sanctioned slavery, colonialism, extractivism, corporate exploitations have all been sanctioned and legitimized and carried by the law. So the inability of law, and in particular international law, to deal with the Anthropocene crisis, I don't think is because law itself is an ineffective instrument, but because we have not been using it as we should have or could. We need to reimagine international environmental law within a planetary context for the purpose of it to become better suited for the altogether new Earth system governance context of the Anthropocene, for international environmental law to decenter the human, and for international environmental law to become much more ambitious in the face of rapidly declining planetary integrity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Much food for thought, I think. Theo Maran will now open the discussion without any further ado, and then we will open the interdisciplinary round, and everyone of you is asked to ask their questions. And if you speak, you have to push the button so the light turns red, and then you have to turn it, of course, off after you've spoken. So, but first, Theo Maran, thank you so much. And can we turn off the beamer? Is that possible?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. First of all, thank you very much, Louis. It's a pleasure to have you with us here. And I recall that I think this was our last project together, this volume on transboundary protection of biodiversity. And actually this matches quite well what we are discussing today, because if I recall it correctly, you wrote a chapter on the Anthropocene, and Aisha Böhringer and I wrote a chapter on the ecosystem approach to international environmental law. So there's a continuation of our debates, I may say. And there is a continuation in another way, because Stefan Peters, our colleague who is heading the Colombian-German Peace Institute, he left for South Africa on Monday. and you are here. So interesting coincidence in a way. But before I start commenting some details of your paper, I would like to take up a phrase which you used quite often. You often said, the law does not, or the law doesn't act. So I would actually counter this with a phrase which you used towards the end of your presentation, when you basically said the law is a social construct. So it is basically our responsibility, and I think we agree on that, to share this responsibility. And it's a political question in the end, which emerges from our analysis of the law and of science. What I'm going to do is to raise 5 issues in my comment, and these 5 issues are not only meant to be addressed to you, but also to invite colleagues to comment on your paper, because these 5 issues rush a little bit through different, let's say, academic fields. I will start first to address colleagues from natural science and to share your comments on the state of international environmental law, because that's where I see we agree basically, well, not on everything, but to a very large extent. A few years, or many years ago, when we discussed air pollution agreements, and that was actually in Potsdam, a colleague actually made a very good statement and said, well, the success of international environmental law in this particular field, and let's talk about the Geneva Convention on Transboundary Air Pollution or some related agreement, is actually that it doesn't impose more than a technological fit to the problem which we see. So we have a technological solution to a particular environmental problem, and then states actually agree that, well, we do not only have this solution, but we make this solution part of law. Another example, apart from the Geneva Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, where we actually integrated filters to reduce CO2 emissions, etc., is the Montreal Protocol about the ozone layer, which also, one might argue, was only adopted because at the time we already knew that we had replacement for CFC-depleting substances, ozone-depleting substances, in particular CFCs. So the question is, do we only respond, humans, do we only respond to environmental problems if we have already a technological fit for these problems? And natural science, engineering, they all contribute to finding technological solutions, not just to actually pinpointing to a problem, but to finding solutions. And this is helpful in one sense. This contributed to some of the success of international environmental law, but obviously not to a change, a radical change of circumstances. And the biggest problem which we are confronted with, obviously climate change, there is no technological fit which we are available. So this would require actually social change and not technological change. I think this is one of the issues. I would like to hear views from natural scientists on actually how the interplay from their perspective between natural science and social science is. The second comment actually addresses my colleagues from law. In basically all of your paper, you have presented an argument to move away from nitty-gritty technical approaches to changing the behavior to the grand issues. One might say you have chosen to go for principles rather than rules. And this distinction, which we know from L.A. Hart and others, actually is something that I believe is indeed of importance in situations when there is little, let's say, political potential to actually change the law. If we have the political potential to change the law, then we very often agree on rules. And then we say, oh yes, categorically, we actually move into that direction. But currently, and the really horrible situation in Ukraine is just one expression of the inability of states to cooperate appropriately with each other in order to promote common goals, common objectives. There are other examples which could follow. Are you pleading for favoring soft law in contrast to hard law? Because of this situation, hard law doesn't move forward, so why don't we actually use... This is a question I'm pinpointing, and the other big issue, obviously, is a fragmentation versus a comprehensive solution, and there I just want to express strong support for integrative efforts. I mean, this is a debate that has been going on for decades now. So it's not new in that sense. We have been discussing about these issues, not we, because I didn't discuss at the time, in the 60s and in the 70s. Already some people promoted the idea, for example, of a global organization for the environment or something the like. My third comment is a little bit of criticism, and this is addressed to colleagues from philosophy, among others. If we follow the approach which you've suggested, and if we go perhaps a little bit further than you suggested, aren't we then moving to a radical naturalist perspective on life? I recently read a very interesting paper by my colleague Heiner Bielefeld, who is working in the area of human rights in particular, and Heiner Bielefeld wrote in a human rights journal a paper on the question of rights of nature, rights of animals, etc., and human rights. And he raised the question whether it is perhaps dangerous to move into a radical naturalist perspective as far as rights are concerned. You mentioned rights of nature, in particular with regard to Latin American constitutions. Indeed, that's in there. I would actually say it's not a rights-based approach in the narrow sense. It's rather a policy approach where we have state policy objectives or something the like, rather than classic rights. But this is obviously a question that needs to be addressed. And my fourth point, before I draw some conclusions, is, and this is a question I really want to put to you, who have you in mind who should be in charge of moving this ahead? This is a great idea from an academic perspective. Is this a feasible idea? I'm not saying a great idea. There's a feasible idea from a political perspective. Are we going to convince actors? And who are the actors we are actually talking about? Who do you want to convince? Is it just us as academics, or do we actually move into another direction? I would assume that we want to convince political actors, and there we come back to the constructivist approach to law as such. Law is basically a social construct, at least that would be my perspective in this context. A few conclusions and suggestions to actually make this practical. First, because that's what you mentioned in your talk, that the practical aspect is relevant. First one, integrating or choosing a more integrative approach towards international and national environmental law. I fully agree. I think the current debate about climate change is illustrating an inability of us humans, because we focus on one aspect of environmental degradation in this context, because it's so pressing, but we have difficulties in accommodating this with other aspects, and that becomes particularly obvious in the context of geoengineering. Geoengineering may help us to accommodate some problems of climate change, but it may have a disastrous effect on biodiversity, among others. It depends. So, integrating various environmental issues, first aspect. Second aspect, a proactive approach. If you are a medic, you would probably say a preventive approach, but we want to go beyond mere prevention. We want to perhaps even go beyond precaution, and this could be both a legal and a political debate. The third aspect is an aspect which we probably altogether in different political fields should stress more, and that is the interrelation between international and national. If we raise the question, who is going to respond to the atrocities that currently occur in Ukraine, it will not, in the first instance, be the International Criminal Court. It will be national courts of some countries that have chosen to pursue this as a political objective. And I think this is important, that we take into account that the national legislature, national courts, will actually play a role in implementing international law, and in particular international environmental law. Coming to the International Environmental Organization, to the question of who could do something, I believe indeed that a realistic political objective could be to support tendencies towards the formation of a true international environmental organization, which has more power than the current UN environment emerged from from UNEP, basically. So, in the end, I think the true challenge currently is to make a vision, which you've shared with us, a practical reality, and that's where I think a lot of work is actually necessary, and where we actually have to think about parallels and differences with regard to the topic before us. Thank you very much, Louis.
Well, thank you so much for such a broad and nuanced comment. I think if that's okay for you, because in terms of time, I would open the floor, and then after we collected a first round of comments and questions, you can respond to all of them. Is that okay? Okay, or you can try to. Okay, who would like to comment? Yes, here's the first.
Okay, I hope this worked. Yeah, so thank you very much for your talk. This was really fascinating, and I certainly share a lot of the points that you make, and I really like your critique of sustainable development as a misguided policy or governance concept. So thank you very much for this.
I'm very sorry, I forgot. Can you just say who you are, so he has a short idea?
Yeah, I'm Andreas Volkers. I'm a postdoc in sociology here at the Justus von Liebig University. Yeah, probably enough. So I have two questions, and the first is really something that I really would like to know, because you. and this is when did environmental law start? International environmental law start. So you gave us a few dates on this, but never really elaborated how this emerged, and this would be something that I would just be interested in. And why I ask this question is also that I had some trouble understanding what you meant when you talked about, and this is also a question about timing, what you meant when you talked about the Anthropocene and the emergence of the Anthropocene context and stuff like that, because it's probably a more general problem that there's often the slippage between when did the Anthropocene start and when did we start to talk about the Anthropocene. And there's a tendency that Buñuel and Frézot in their Shock of the Anthropocene called the ecocratic grand narrative of the Anthropocene to say, oh, it actually only started to become something that is legislatable in a way when Earth system science discourse started to say something about this. And in a way, in how you address this, it kind of seemed that you said, okay, international law, which I assume started in like the 1960s, 1970s, emerged in a time when we still had a Holocene imaginary, and now we have this Anthropocene imaginary. And I wonder if what would happen if we would set the timing differently? If we would say, okay, the Anthropocene maybe started at the very moment when international law, for example, emerged at all. So Carl Schmitt, for example, famously argued in the Nomos of the Earth that international law started with the emergence of the new Weltbild, which was, he doesn't say that, but which was coincided, of course, with colonialism, and for many Anthropocene scholars, colonialism is the start of the Anthropocene. So what could we say more generally about law or international law and the relation between law and the Anthropocene when we would ask the question, how did the Anthropocene very early on shape law and vice versa?
My name is Jürgen Bast. I'm a colleague of Thilo's at the Faculty of Law. Thank you for your presentation. I have observed that both on the level of diagnosis as well as regarding your suggestions for reform, you argued on the level of conceptions and substance rather than institutions and procedures. So my simple question would be, what are the institutional implications of your suggestions, and maybe what are maybe the missing part of the picture in your diagnosis in criticizing the law as it stands or the legal situations as it stands? Maybe we should focus more on the deficiencies of how the institutional machinery of international environmental law works rather than its substance, I wonder. Thank you.
Otherwise, I'll try it like this. Reimer, also teaching law at the law faculty at Gießen University. Now, in European climate protection law and European energy law, one of the key words is energy efficiency, and the maxim is energy efficiency first. In Germany, and probably not just in Germany, for a couple of years now, people start to talk about sufficiency or frugality, Sufficiency. Now I wonder, could this be part of the new paradigm? So it implies social change, not just technological change. And I wonder if even on the level of environmental international law, sufficiency could be a new light build.
Anyone else? Maybe we also take the question from the chat.
I hope my microphone will decide working. Hiya, maybe you can move this a little bit further to my side. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, so I hope the chat can hear me now. I'll just speak up a bit. Saimi Payne is first of all thanking you for these interesting remarks, and she's wondering, could you comment on the current effort, possibly concluding in August, to negotiate a treaty for conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in ABNY? And she's furthermore asking, what should be included in the agreement to make it the first Earth system treaty? And someone is typing, so I assume there might be...
That's for the next round.
Yes. You can now switch it off again.
Okay, so I allow myself to also ask one question because it relates to number 4 of Tilo Maron's comments.
Oh.
If you so you talked about how Earth system science should be connected more closely to Earth system law. How should the insights gained by Earth system science could feed into Earth system law? And as a democracy scholar, I have to ask, if you think about the constitutional moment or something like that, who would be included in the formulation of planetary law? So who would be the constituency? Who would be the citizens? Would it be also the non-human? And is there any idea you have about how this constitutional moment could become reality, and who would be involved in that or something like that?
Okay, thank you for all of these wonderful insights, Tilo, and also the critique and certainly also the questions. Perhaps to start with yours first, Frederik. I don't necessarily think that this will require an inauguration of some kind of global constitutional moment. I think it will be a much more gradual process where the relational links and the mutual supportiveness between scientific evidence, for example, could be better integrated in many practical ways into the legal making processes. That would require, for example, among many others, that we need to rethink how we do conferences of the parties. Do we not need an alternative model where we could include broader representative actors, also from the youth movement, for example, in the climate change context, climate scientists, to somehow have a greater say and deliberate inputs within the legal making processes. How exactly that should be done, I cannot say. But I would certainly argue strongly that the Earth system perspective, to the extent that it requires also a greater reliance on Earth system science, and to address Tilo's issue, how does it happen in practice, would require some of the basic law-making processes and procedures, your issue as well, to be fundamentally rethought. That is obviously not only a legal task, that is something, that is a much broader effort, cross-disciplinary effort as well, with significant political implications, of course, because there you go down to the political legitimacy and who makes law, who can make law. But I would also caution to say that I don't think that this is a panacea. The notion of Earth system law wouldn't solve it immediately. It is rather more of a conceptual start to think about a direction that could shape more practical interventions over time. And I think the only argument that I've been trying to make is to say that law has not been sufficiently systems oriented and sensitive to systems complexity. certainly from a conceptual level. And I think one sees this also playing out in practice. And this was also one of the questions that were asked. For example, regime interaction. How does the biodiversity regime interact with the climate regime, with the global oceans framework? That could all happen much better than it currently is happening. And political scientists who obviously study regime interaction and complexity and trade-offs would have better answers to this. But that certainly also points to the need to go beyond conceptualism and start to grapple with the practicalities of how to implement this at the ground level. And I recognize the gap in the current research. And hopefully this, as the discourse around planetary law, Earth system law, another name, develops, one would hope that there would be a greater focus also on how to operationalize it as such. I don't think it would be an immediate process. I think it will take some time. And whether it will be taken up by the type of actors who should be responsible also for doing this, of course, is the million-dollar question. With respect to Thilo's issue, your question about technological fixes, I think you're absolutely right, of course. But we should also recognize that it is partly technology that got us into this mess. It was the invention of the steam engine. So we should use the technologies very carefully. And I think that that also raises, for me rather, ethical issues. If one speaks of climate geoengineering, it could work. We don't know whether it would. If it does work, and often these technologies offload disproportional impacts also on least developed countries in the global south. So it also often tends to exacerbate the global injustices. So how the law will have to go about including and propagating and driving these technological fixes and to elevate the kind of idea of earth masters remains to be seen. But I would certainly argue for a very cautious approach there. And that one, personally, I would fall back on ethical arguments to say, unless there is sufficient evidence that whatever technological fixes will have only benefits, we should be extremely careful in pursuing whatever is done there. And this is also what we argued in a recent article against solar geoengineering. That was a group of scholars also led by Frank Biermann, where we deliberately pleaded for a non-use agreement. We said that states should think of actually banning climate geoengineering if we don't have the certainty that it only has benefits. So based on the precautionary principles certainly there. And we got a lot of criticism also because especially from several American scholars saying, well, we should use all options that's on the table. And I agree that we should do that, but very carefully, I would say. In terms of principles and specific rules to change behavior, I would agree that the proposal set out here and elsewhere departs from the assumption that principles would first be needed. It would depart from a principled approach, and then hopefully the principles that could be designed, and getting back to your issue, the principle, for example, of sufficiency, is what one of the colleagues in the Earth System Governance Network, working also on Earth System Law, has actually proposed. Principle of sufficiency, the principle of humility, the principle of reciprocity, several other principles that should guide the further development of the more specific rules, going then from soft law to more enforceable normative standards in the realm of hard treaty law, for example. Your issue, Thilo, of the radical naturalist approach. I don't think that we should be too afraid of that. I think to the extent that, let's say, the rights of nature paradigm argues for a change of ethics and an alternative platform to try and understand the world and to try and understand alternative ways to better care, to better see, and to know things differently is not necessarily a dangerous naturalist approach. I would rather argue that it is essentially needed, because that would be foundational to try and change the prevailing predatory worldview upon which most, if not all, of our social institutions are built. Your fourth question was about the academic focus. I must admit that this is very much still an academic exercise, and a lot of the criticism against, or critique, comments against our project of Earth System Law is that, yes, but what's the practical value of this? And currently we still need to think more about this. That is the easy way out here of your difficult question. But it also highlights the point that we would need to start thinking of and making suggestions for ways in which the lawmakers, certainly at the international level, could better grasp and embrace the Earth system perspective when, for example, making international environmental law. And again, I don't think that is only a question for lawyers. I think that there would be several disciplines there that could add a lot of value to that. Your questions on the start of international environmental law. Thilo actually wrote a book on that. And he says that it all started in the late 1800s, early 1900s with those treaties, for example, the First Seals Convention, and many of the treaties that at that time were designed mostly for the benefit of colonial states to exploit natural resources in the global south. So the aim mostly was to protect those natural resources, not for the sake of their protection, but to ensure that there's still enough and that the indigenous people couldn't or shouldn't use them, that there's enough for the colonial powers. And I would say that, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say that the foundations, the global constitutional moment for international environmental law probably was with the first Stockholm Conference in 1972. And that is also why the language is so important, because some of the paragraphs that I mentioned is exactly this type of anthropocentric language that was already deeply embedded during the foundational moment of the founding moments of international environmental law. And I think that's also why it's so difficult to get rid of it, in a sense, because it's been so long with us. As for the start of the Anthropocene, you would know as well as I do that there's such a debate on this. When did it start? Was it with the Great Acceleration? Have we not always been in the Anthropocene? Because this is also a type of epoch that we are trying to declare before it's actually even happened, in a sense. Unlike the Holocene epoch. I mean, we are talking about billions and billions of years trying to look back and declare an epoch. So actually, the Anthropocene already existed in 1972, during Stockholm. Of course it did. But at that time, we didn't realize, or we didn't perceive it to exist. The idea of the Anthropocene, whatever your idea of it might be. My idea of the Anthropocene is human domination of a fragile Earth system. That is how I see it. And there's, of course, many different views on that. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you so much. We are already running out of time, so is there any pressing last question?
There's one more in the chat. I was just about.
Is it a pressing one?
I cannot. I think it's a really important one, and we could also move the question from the audience.
Yeah, that would be my
It's
idea.
a bit of a lengthy one concerning the planetary paradigm and in connection of the humanities and the role the humanities would play. So maybe I'll just read it out. It's from Anna Taboratsidis. She thanks you for the lecture as well. And she was asking, wouldn't a rethinking along Earth systems or planetary paradigms be needed across the board? Thinking here of a new legal or subsidiary body which would be able to combine or coordinate efforts in international environmental law, financial law, etc. And she is thinking here of something like Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, which enforces a carbon coin, cooperative social models based on Mondragon, etc. And she's wondering which role will the humanities play in the reshaping of biocentric imaginaries. Maybe it's a bit of a big question, but I think a really great one.
Maybe it's kind of a question that we can take to us with dinner, as all the other questions you might have. Louis, thank you so much. I think your presentation provoked exactly this, a lot of debates and questions we couldn't answer yet, but that is the task of our panel, to open up new exploration spaces. And so thank you again very, very much. And also Thilo Maraun for these excellent comments. Thank you again.